All right. All right, Ramblers, let's ramble. We have a special guest today, Dr. Jay Bhattacharya. For those who don't know, my name is Dean Antonio. I teach mostly political science courses, um, mostly about human rights, civil liberties, but a lot about censorship. And one of the things I teach several classes, and in several classes, there's kind of an ongoing thread with regard to censorship. And some of my students actually were talking about the censorship that was going on during COVID, and Dr. Jay Bhattacharya's name came up because of something called the Great Barrington Declaration. First things first, we want to introduce Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, and I want to give a quick little summary of your career. Professor at Stanford University Medical School. What's the weather out there like? Pretty nice?
It's nice today.
Must be nice, huh? Living out where
Been here
it's
for
always
40
sunny.
years, Dean. I have to say one of the problems with being here for 40 years is you take for granted how beautiful the place actually is, but it is beautiful.
Yeah, you can't leave.
Yeah.
um, Physician, are you still a physician? Like, do you still practice medicine, or are you only involved in the research
I'm only
aspect?
involved in research. Actually, I have an MD and I have a PhD in economics, but I don't practice, and I never practice. Actually, I
Okay,
finished medical school and went straight into research. I teach medical students though for a living.
okay, and you're still teaching, right? You're still in the classroom.
Yeah.
Excellent. And finally, public health policy expert focusing on infection diseases and vulnerable populations. I checked your CV online; it's like 16 pages, but I think it was an old one. So you've got the bona fides, you've done the work. First, I want to ask you, how are you doing just with regard to having come out of being censored, being smeared, just health wise, you and your family, is everything all right?
Yeah, I'm doing okay. If you'd asked me in 2020, I mean, I'm normally a very relaxed guy. It was a time of tremendous anxiety for me, professionally. I had for 2 straight years. I had death threats. I was worried about my family being, sort of harmed by my notoriety. It was really tough those 2 years. But basically since Omicron. My life has been okay. I mean, like mentally, I'm good. I'm still writing and trying to advocate for sane policy. So I'm okay. I'm doing well.
Well, I'm glad. That's good to hear because we need, unfortunately, people that speak out um, are usually the ones who get silenced. And like I tell my students, they don't silence you for lying; they silence you for telling the truth, right? And it all depends on what the narrative is. And in this case, the narrative was, for the most part, if I can be reductionist, this thing is the plague. It's going to kill everybody. We need severe lockdowns. We need people to stay at home. We need masks. And eventually, we need this thing called a vaccine. At what point do you and some colleagues get together and say, you know what? We're a little bit concerned about the way things are going here. We're public health experts. We have some concerns, and how that leads into the Great Barrington Declaration.
So actually, it was the very earliest days of the pandemic. I was looking at data out of China. I was looking at the data from this cruise ship that gotten infected, this Diamond Princess cruise and it was. I mean, I thought that let's just put ourselves in like January, February 2020. The public health establishment was quite reasonable. Like they it seemed like they understood that the high risk people were the older people. Based on the data, was really clear that was the case. That the disease was really quite easily spread. Right, it already spread
Right.
to Iran. It had spread to Italy. There were a whole bunch of countries and on the Diamond Cruise, it had spread to basically everybody. Um, Diamond Princess cruise ship, it had spread to everybody. And so, like the in February 2020, I was concerned about the disease, but I wasn't concerned about public health. They seemed to be reacting normally in ways that would be constructive. In March of 2020, when the lockdowns came, I was absolutely alarmed. I couldn't believe that public health had done this thing that was going to so obviously harm the lives of the poor, that was going to harm the lives of the vulnerable, of the working class at scale. And I also it was really
And it
hard for
did, by the way.
oh
So
good.
all of your fears actually came to fruition.
Yeah, I mean it's I mean, the thing is we like the people in public health that were pushing the idea that we can stay home and stay safe, they had a very privileged view of who of sort of economic reality, right? If you have a large home and with good internet and your kids can go have their own room to do Zoom school, great. But if you are living in rural Uganda, there's no internet, there's intermittent power outages every day. There's the schools shut down. That means your kids don't get a source of food. They don't get a source of they don't get the basic education. And that, I mean, it was very, very clear that was what the lockdowns actually meant, that the poorest people were going to pay the price. Um, the other thing I saw was that there was like there was no evidence that had been generated in March of 2020 that there were actually the disease of how widespread the disease actually was. The way that you generate that evidence is by not by like counting how many people show up at the hospital that have the disease, though you do that by measuring antibodies, how many people have antibodies in the population. And so I wrote an op-ed in March 2020 uh, on the couple of days after the lockdown started saying, look, we really need a study to understand how many people have had the disease. So A, we can understand how deadly disease actually is. Unless you have the denominator of how many people got it, you can't say what the death rate is. You're going to exaggerate the death rate because you'll only focus on the set of people that were very, very sick that got it. And the second thing is it'll help us understand, is the lockdown even feasible? Like there's no chance of, if a whole bunch of people have already got it outside of the ken of public health, then what's the lockdown for? Eventually everyone's going to get it, right? This is a disease that's very difficult to stop to stop the spread of. In fact, I'd say more than difficult, it's impossible. We have no technology to
It's
stop the spread.
impossible, right? And
Yeah.
you just, I don't know if you were, last night I was checking you out on a lot of different, with a lot of different hosts. I don't know if you did the Kim Iverson show. She's been on this actually since the beginning.
It was great. She was wonderful there.
She's been amazing, right? And again, but it shows you what happens to the leaders, the people that ask the questions, and people have integrity, because she was going to do an interview with Dr. Fauci on her show and basically got kicked off of her show because they knew that she was going to ask tough questions. And this was one of the things that frustrated me at the beginning, even when I didn't care about the science. I didn't know anything about the science. I really didn't care about COVID, to be honest with you. I don't have kids, not married, and I kind of live a laissez-faire. I have a laissez-faire attitude with regard to, some things. And so I didn't really care about the science that much. What I cared about, as I always do, is the censorship and people not being allowed to give their opinions. How can I make an informed decision on my health of loved ones, people around me, people that are talking, if I can't have access to all sides of the equation, if I can't listen to an epidemiologist from Stanford who's got the credentials, and all of a sudden he comes out with this thing called the Great Barrington Declaration. I would like to see it. I'd like to see people talking about it. I'd like to see you debating, you and Dr. Malone, Dr. Peter McCullough. I'd like to see you on television debating people on the Fauci side. And it never happened. Instead, what they did to you was they basically just smeared you. How long did it take once you started writing the Barrington, or actually once it was released, how long did it take for the hammer to come down and for everybody, just basically all the forces to hit you and your coworkers and your colleagues?
So we wrote the Great Barrington Declaration with Martin Kulldorff of Harvard and Sunetra Gupta of Oxford in October 2020. So this is a few months on after the start of the pandemic. Those few months were tremendously stressful for me. Like there was all these attacks on my family. There was attacks on me. The university went after me. Mainly my crime was I ran a study. I ran this study and I thought, okay, this is insane. Like I've written
You did
many,
science, in other words.
yeah, and they just people, the powers that be didn't like the answer. In October 2020, when Martin invited me to write the great to come to this conference in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, I jumped at the chance because I was going to get to meet Sunetra Gupta. It was going to be I mean, she's a hero of mine. We wrote this declaration October 4th, 2020. 4 days after we wrote it, Francis Collins, the head of the National Institute of Health, writes an email to Tony Fauci. The email calls the three of us, Martin Kulldorff of Harvard University, Sunetra Gupta of Oxford University, professor of theoretical epidemiology. Here, okay, you have it. He called the three of us fringe epidemiologists. He lamented.
Let me read it for people.
Okay.
This proposal, this is from Francis Collins from the NIH, the National Institute of Health, to Tony Fauci. This proposal from 3 fringe epidemiologists, boom, right out the gate. They got you. You're fringe. Who met with the secretary, seems to be getting a lot of attention. We don't want that. And even a co-signature from Nobel Prize winner Mike Levitt at Stanford. So, oh my God, they even have a Nobel Prize winner. And here's my favorite part. There needs to be a quick and devastating published takedown of its premises. I don't see anything like it online yet. Is it underway? Thank you very much, Francis Collins. So let me get back here.
Oh my God.
Ridiculous. Like this is the kind of stuff that let me get rid of my share here.
The thing is, Dean, is like that. It's what this represents is as an enormous abuse of power. This guy's the head of the NIH, so he controls the funding and the social status and the success of basically every biomedical scientist of note in this country. So when he calls for a devastating takedown, he's not just silencing me, he's silencing every scientist that has any desire to make a successful career in biomedical sciences. Well,
it's a warning shot too, right? It's a warning shot to everybody else. Look what happens when you get out of line.
And that, for me personally, it led to death threats. It led to just hit piece after hit piece, a spurious hit. I mean, I had hoped with the Great Barrington Declaration to start the kind of debate and conversation that you wanted, that it would lead public health officials to come to the table and say, well, look, how should we protect vulnerable people? Are school closures actually, is there any evidence for them? Like I was expecting a creative response by public health by this challenge posed by us. The idea of the Great Barrington Declaration is lift the lockdowns and protect vulnerable older people. That was the one-page document. Anyone can read it. Our aim was to spur a conversation. Instead, we got ad hominem attacks. We got there's all these like crazy hippies saying I wanted to let the virus rip, as if I wanted my mom to die from getting the virus. And it was organized by Tony Fauci and Francis Collins from the very top of biomedical sciences in this country. And it was one of these things where I still can't wrap my mind around how they thought it was ethical to do that. Instead of having a conversation, and maybe I was wrong. It turns out I was right, but maybe I was right. Show me I'm wrong. Let's have a conversation, and you bring your evidence, I'll bring my evidence, and we can decide. That's how science normally gets done. That speech is central to science.
And at no point did anybody actually sit down and systematically try and take down point by point of the Great Barrington Declaration or its premises. Instead, it was, who are these guys? They're fringe. They don't know what they're talking about. And like you just said, they said, and I saw that quote, they said, we don't want to let these co-signatures, we don't want the virus to rip through the population. And they use that as if your intent was to let it rip through the population, as if you are all sitting around saying, hey, we need to get everybody to get COVID.
It's crazy. I mean, what the thing we're proposing is protecting vulnerable older people. The lockdowns have already failed to protect vulnerable older people. I think 40% of the deaths were in nursing homes. 80% of the deaths have been people over 65 through October 2020. I think that's still true today. The lockdowns didn't protect them in spring. Why would they protect them later? The premise that the lockdowns were the way to protect older people was wrong. It was just purely wrong. You could see it in the data, especially in poor countries. It was wrong. And so I think
absolutely. And poor countries got hit the most. Like you look at the continent of Africa and what happened there, they were one of the lowest. Well, they had the lowest rate of vaccinations. But they also had, this was the paradox, right? The mystery. Why did they have the lowest rate of deaths? So at one point, I'm reading an article actually that talks about this paradox. And you would think that scientists would say, hey, what's going on over there? Their deaths are low, yet their vaccination rates are low. So maybe there's something there that we can look at. Instead, when you look at these articles, even though the death rate was low, the point of the article was, how are we going to get them vaccinated more? How are we going to get Africans to our levels of vaccination? And nobody said, well, hold on here. What is it that they have? What is it that's particular or unique to Africa? Well, one thing is they're the lowest, the youngest age group. It's the youngest population.
3% are over the age of 65 in Africa.
Exactly.
I think that idea That's, in fact, that's the heart of the Great Barrington Declaration, that there's this enormous risk stratification by something that's obvious and easily measurable, age, right? A
Right.
thousandfold or more difference between the oldest and the youngest, more than a thousandfold actually, in terms of the mortality risk of getting, if you die, if you get COVID. Um, and so, I mean, so that what that means is you can focus your attention on protecting vulnerable. So, like, I think it was right to want to vaccinate older people in 2021, given the data that we had, right? That prioritizing that made sense given the uncertainties at the time. Vaccinating young people, no, that didn't make any sense. Like the absolute risk reduction is tiny,
Yes.
and you have this uncertainty about what the side effects of the profiles of the vaccines are. So why would you make it a priority? Certainly, you could say why vaccinate old people, young people at all, but certainly why would you make it a priority to vaccinate young people? It made no sense. And yet, if you made that point in 2021, you were censored.
You were
My
censored,
colleague,
yeah.
my colleague Martin Kulldorff made that point on Twitter in 2021. He got kicked off Twitter until he deleted the tweet saying it's not rational to have the same policy for older and younger people for the vaccine.
So Dr. Koldorf, who was like you had mentioned earlier, who invited you, basically you wrote the Great Barrington Declaration with him. Essentially, he's been fired, right?
Yeah, he was
Just
fired.
as within the last 2 weeks.
Well, it's a little. So he wrote a piece in the last 2 weeks revealing that he was fired. That firing actually happened, I think, in October, November
Okay.
2023. So yeah, but he was on leave in 2021. He was put on leave in 2021. So it was the Harvard treated him abysmally, right? The specifics of the firing were he had COVID in February 2021. February 2021, you had COVID. The data had come out by then, by certainly by late spring 2021, that if you'd had COVID and recovered, that you'd had excellent immunity. In fact,
Right.
so the marginal benefit of the vaccine is very, very low. Looking at that scientific evidence, he said, "I don't want the vaccine. It doesn't make sense for me. I've already had COVID." And Harvard imposed a vaccine mandate on him and its other employees. He put in an exemption, um, citing this scientific evidence. And he's a world expert in exactly this kind of science. And Harvard still fired him over this. They put him on leave over
Right,
this,
right.
and then leave without pay for 2 years, and then fired him.
It was rampant. So every province did things differently. I guess every state did things differently. Here at my college, we had an individual who was one of the smartest managers at the college. Brilliant, spoke several languages. Anytime there was a new position, a leadership position that came up, everybody wanted him to get this. I mean, he was just a leader and always called. If he thought that something wasn't right, he would just say it. He didn't feel the need to basically go along with the flow. So all the teachers were required to get vaccinated at the college, and he said, well, I'm not going to fire any of my teachers if they're not vaccinated, and he was fired. And what that does is it gets rid of the actual leaders who are willing to stand up when people are lying and when people are censoring and when people don't know what they're talking about. You need people like that, and now he's gone. So I suspect that in his case at Harvard, there must have been others as well. Was there a mass exodus of people who didn't want to get vaccinated? Because I know a lot of people that lost their jobs because they didn't want to get vaccinated in academia.
I mean, certainly in medical schools and in hospitals. Actually, so certainly in Canada, this happened. Huge numbers of nurses got fired over because they'd already had COVID. It made no rational sense for them to
Right.
get the vaccine. Um, and they're required to get the vaccine. Then you see these like reports about staff shortages in hospitals.
Yes, we have them.
And you're absolutely right, Dean, that a lot of the leaders, the reason why they went after Martin and me and Sinatra is because it sent a message to everybody. Look, you better comply or else.
Yeah.
That's the way the censorship worked. It wasn't just well, that was one of the ways the censorship worked. It was like making examples of people who stuck their neck out. Um, the other way it worked is just underneath the radar screen. Like they would Maybe you're going to ask me about this team, so sorry to
All right,
jump the
go
gun.
ahead.
But I'm involved with this lawsuit brought by the Missouri and Louisiana Attorney General's office against the Biden administration. What we found in the context of this lawsuit is that the Biden administration had set up a enormous infrastructure to silence people online that disagreed with them.
And we have, by the way, this isn't, if anybody's watching, it's like, oh, what is he talking about? Conspiracies, boogeyman. We have the receipts. You can go online. The headlines are there. They've admitted it. We know that they conspired. The government conspired with social media and big pharma to silence individuals that were asking questions and doing what you were doing. We know that.
It's remarkable. I sound, I gotta say, Dina, like when I say this, I sound to myself like a conspiracy theorist, except that I've seen the emails,
You've seen them, yeah?
I've seen in this lawsuit, the judge, this federal judge, allowed us to depose Tony Fauci. Allow us to depose people. Depose means talk to under oath
Yep.
for hours, and to the people in the Surgeon General's office, the U.S. CDC, the NIH, even the FBI, the White House itself. And what we found was a systematic infrastructure that had direct connections with social media companies, their trust and safety divisions, where they would tell the social media companies, you must censor these people and these ideas, with an implied threat that if they didn't, that their companies would get destroyed, right? With like regulatory action. The lower court judges that heard this, the lower court judge that heard this, he called this a ministry of truth. That's how he ended his decision. He considered it an
Wow.
Orwellian ministry of truth that has no place in the American Republic. Like it violates the First Amendment. The appeals court, the Fifth Circuit Appeal Court, who heard this, they likened it to Al Capone in Chicago. The famous gangster would go to businesses and say, "Look, you got to pay me protection money."
It's it's racketeering. It was racketeering, is what they did to you. It's racketeering.
Yeah, and the purpose was to silence people that criticized the government policy, right? So, and it wasn't just people; it was ideas, whole themes, right? So they forced, for instance, Facebook to take down pages of people with true vaccine injuries. These are patient groups. The patients, when they have difficulty getting the medical care system to listen to them, they form these patient groups to give support to each other, hurting people. And the government told Facebook they had to take down these groups or else. They had these AI algorithms that would just that tag tweets or posts at scale. If it looked at all like it was contrary to government. Actually, there's a really funny story. The government, the federal government, forced Facebook to have these like systems in place to tag posts that were deemed anti-vax. In April of 2021, the CDC issued a warning that the Johnson & Johnson vaccine had a signal of for young women, this excess rates of clotting, blood clotting. And so they paused the J&J vaccine. The White House shared this fact on its Facebook page. The AI algorithms the White House itself had induced tagged the White House as an anti-vax group because it shared. I mean,
everybody got tagged. Everybody got tagged. You ask a question, you got tagged. You weren't vaccinated, you got tagged. I had an owner of a diner. I always went to his diner. Hadn't seen him in a while because of the lockdowns. Started talking about the vaccine. And he goes, "You got to get vaccinated." I said, "No, I got natural immunity. I'm fine." And his first reaction was, "Are you a Trumper? This is in Canada. This isn't the United States. This is in Canada." And first of all, he pushed the vaccine, so that's dumb. But what you saw was this politicalization of the vaccine, of the lockdowns, of masks, and your opinion on COVID basically then put you in a camp. You're either a right winger, you're a left winger. You were a conspiracy theorist, or you believed in science, like Tony Science, right? The things that I want to talk quick, go back to the Declaration for a second, because the thing that was most interesting to me in what you were proposing, the targeted protection, right? Is that what you would call it? Targeted protection?
Focus,
So,
but yeah, same thing. Yeah.
okay, so focus protection. So we've got the oldest people. We've got the oldest. We got people comorbidities. They're in they're in their 80s, diabetes, weight, whatever. We didn't actually look at them first, did we? We just basically said, whoever wants it, here it is. First come, first serve. We didn't actually look at who was the most vulnerable within our society, did we?
I mean, I think that if we had deeply understood and structured our policies around the epidemiological fact that it's older people that are really at the most vulnerable, we would have chosen very, very different policies and we would have fared much better. I think so. Just to give a few early instances, right? So, in New York, the governor of New York, Andrew Cuomo at the time, sent COVID-infected patients from hospitals into nursing homes. Well, why did he do that? Because the priority was protecting hospital beds, not protecting people, not protecting the vulnerable.
Mm,
Right? If the orientation had been let's protect the vulnerable, then there's no way he would have done that. There's
right.
zero chance because why would you send COVID infected patients exactly where they are exposing the most vulnerable? They would never have done that. Actually in Quebec there was a travesty with that where the nursing homes, workers in nursing homes were so scared of COVID that they abandoned patients with dementia to die of dehydration.
Yes, I saw
Um,
that.
so and now we closed universities and sent kids that were in the universities home to their parents from instead of sitting around in dorms. We created multi-generational homes, thus increasing the amount of exposure that older people had in those homes to young people by closing the universities.
Yes.
Something we would never have done if
Yeah.
we had prioritized protection of older people. We gave in California we gave priority for homeless people to get access to hotel rooms. I have no problem with that per se, but but what if instead we've offered this service to older people living in multi-generational homes, saying, look, you can have access to the hotel room if Johnny comes home and or calls you and says that he was exposed to COVID. Grandma calls up public
Sure.
health and they get a hotel room for her for 2 days or
Yeah.
3 days until you find out Johnny's negative, right? I mean, I think those or organizing home delivery of groceries
Yeah.
to older people. I mean, we could have structured our response
Mm.
around this epidemiological recognition. Of course, it would have been very different in Manitoba than it would have been
Yes.
in California. But the point is that local public health could have creatively addressed the living circumstances of the old. That was the whole purpose of the Great Barrington Declaration. It was to tell the world that we should be structuring our response around protection of old people, not structuring our response around suppressing all interactions, which was an insane idea that harmed so many people.
Yeah, and the other thing too that I've been hearing for the last, I don't know, decade when it comes to old people is we got to get them out more. We got to get them exercise because they're all weak. They don't have a lot of muscle. So here, what we did in the middle of winter, I mean, it's like January and it was absolutely freezing out. And I called a couple of colleagues. I said, "You want to go for a walk in the park?" And they said, "Well, we're not allowed to." And I said, "What do you mean we're not allowed to? I mean, the park is for old. This is where old people should be. They should be walking. They're out in fresh air. They'll be cold." And instead, we have them locked up. And what happened in New York was it was a travesty. It was absolute travesty. But by not focusing on the older people and by just kind of treating everybody the same, by the way, we would never do that in any other disease, would we?
I
treat
mean,
treat every every age group, every demographic the same? Would we ever do that?
it makes no sense. Like you try to find risk factors for a disease, and then you use those risk factors to develop treatments that are specific for people with those risk factors, or to protect the people with the high risk factors. That's normal. You devote resources to where they're going to do the most good. Um, Here you had a disease where that you had this enormous risk factor. I mean, it gets very rare in epidemiology to find a risk factor so large as this. Every 7 years of age, you double the risk of dying if you get infected. That's what the data were showing early in the pandemic. So, a young person near zero risk of dying, An old person in their 80s with multiple comorbid conditions, maybe 5%, 6%, 7% are dying if they get COVID. Why would you spend any time thinking about how to protect young people when you have limited resources from this disease that doesn't affect them? But in fact, when the thing that you're doing is going to end up harming the young person, you keep them out of school, you're going to harm them. You prevent them from doing their job, they can't feed their family, you're going to harm them. Rather than spending the resources you have to protect the people you know are most vulnerable. That's normally what you do in medicine. That's normally what you do in epidemiology. And yet during the pandemic, it was let's prevent all disease of all
Yeah.
COVID at all costs, no matter what.
Well, Kim Iverson just had a guest a few days ago who wants to lock down the whole country for like 2 weeks. They're still talking about zero COVID. They're still talking about zero COVID. And Fauci visited China and he loved what he saw there. But we have to go now to the other side of the coin because we let them down. So we didn't help the old people. We let them down. We really did. Nobody ever loses their jobs over these things, by the way. But by the same token, we also ruined young people with the lockdowns, didn't we? The students that I'm seeing before and after the lockdowns, they're not as vocal in the classroom. They're not likely to ask questions. They're afraid to approach. They're afraid to ask certain questions to certain teachers about certain topics. Um, we really ruined a lot of children, didn't we?
For nothing.
For nothing.
The data, let's just focus on young children. In spring of 2020, the Swedish public health authorities, following their standard pandemic plans, kept schools open for kids 15 and under completely. Like they did not recommend school closures. Most kids in Sweden of those ages had normal life. They had no masks, no social distancing. They had regular school. By the end of spring of 2020, they did an evaluation, the Swedish health authorities alongside with the health authority of Finland. And what they found was that no kids 15 and under had died during that spring, and that the teachers themselves were better protected against COVID than the average of workers in the population. Being around kids actually protected the teachers for reasons we can talk about immunologically. Um, the key point is that there was no evidence that the school closures had protected anybody. And those kids, when they go back and look for learning loss estimates, Swedish kids that age has zero learning loss.
I saw that. So in your world, is anybody, while this is going on, is Dr. Fauci or any of his lackeys basically saying, look what's going on in Sweden. They're doing something right. Best practices. Shouldn't we look at them and see what they're doing right? Or was it just excuse making? They're different.
Yeah, so much of Europe followed the Swedish example. Like the schools in 2020 or late 2020 and early 2021 in Europe were much more likely to be open than the schools in the United States. And that's because they were looking at the Swedish data. In the United States, we just ignored the data. And in fact, Tony Fauci did exactly the opposite. Through much of summer of 2020, he was fear mongering about how risky COVID was to kids, emphasizing the really, really uncertain evidence about hypothetical long-term damage to kids from getting COVID, as if it were possible to protect kids from getting COVID at all, and with data that just didn't make sense given what the European evidence was saying. So yeah, we basically ignore the scientific data in 2020. As a result, in summer of 2020, a colleague of mine, a friend of mine, who's the editor of JAMA Pediatrics, wrote a piece. So if you stop school for a short while, you just think, okay, it's not a big deal, but actually it is a big deal. The social science literature shows that if you restrict kids from going to school for a while, there are long-term consequences to their health and well-being, because they're going to end up being poorer, they're going to end up being less healthy, they're going to end up living shorter lives. My colleague Dimitri Kostakis estimated that the spring school closures alone had cost American school children 5.5 million life years. And if you look
There's a
abroad,
similar heading from UNICEF as well.
yeah, it's just so there's evidence, Dean. So yeah, I mean, what the evidence abroad was that, especially in poor countries, we've caused. If you worry about inequality, we've caused inequality, catastrophic generational inequality. Uganda, after 2 years of basically no school for kids, 2 years of no school because they don't have many of them didn't have Zoom school, didn't have internet, didn't have
Right.
access to any of this. 4.5 million kids never came back. They just dropped out. And what that means is like you play this out, they're gonna be poor the rest
They're
of
going
their
to be
life.
poor. They may turn to crime. They may end up
Oh God, it's even more
worse.
heartbreaking than that, Dean. So
Oh
there were
no.
these UN reports that a lot of those kids, the young girls were sold into sexual slavery and the young boys put into child labor because their parents faced the choice between them starving and doing this and this horrible immoral thing. And they
Yeah, and if
chose
yeah,
the
that's
immoral
awful.
thing over over the starvation. The lockdowns put the poorest people of the world into this in tremendous moral quandary because of the poverty it caused.
Even
And
here, not poor countries, but even in rich countries, the poorest populations, the laptop class loved it. The people that were traveling that can work from their laptop. I have a nephew who basically worked full time in 20 different countries. Like he just brought his laptop and he loved it, right? He just loved it. Teachers, unfortunately, a lot of colleagues, basically, they didn't want to go into the classroom anymore just because it's an easy gig to teach from home, even though they don't learn as much, in my opinion. Um, but my God, when you're talking about being in a country where now you're being forced into sexual slavery because maybe your parents have 5 or 6 kids. If we can sell off one of the girls, we can feed the 5 boys.
yeah, I mean that's exactly the moral quandary we put people in, right? It's not I don't even blame the parents. Really, it's the fault of the policymakers who decided on the lockdowns. It was utterly predictable, Dean. It wasn't like it was a surprise this happened, right? We knew that we were going to put a tremendous number of very poor people into dire straits with these lockdowns. The economic dislocation caused by these lockdowns, absolutely certain. You had a World Bank put out a report very early in the pandemic saying that we are going to throw 100 million people into dire poverty, $2 a day or less of income.
And it
When
was the
you
biggest upward transfer of wealth in human history in your country. I don't know about ours, but probably.
absolutely, actually, no, in Canada too,
I do.
right?
Well,
It
here's the thing. So I got these students, they're like 17, 18, 19 years old, and they're pissed. They're like, nobody asked us anything. We were at home. They told us what to do. Adults are always telling us what to do anyway. So they have no say. They get to the university. Some of their teachers are basically they're COVID bullies. So if they ask a question, they get, beat up on in the classroom. So some of the questions I have from some of my students are just basic ones. Like if I go to my doctor and I say to my doctor, what are the chances of me dying or being hospitalized? Will that doctor actually have the information? I suspect they actually won't.
I mean, there was a systematic overestimation by the medical profession, public health of the damage of the likelihood of death from COVID infection. And in fact, it was made into a virtue to exaggerate it.
Yeah.
Um, and I think a lot of it was a psychological manipulation tool. If people are scared of getting COVID, more scared than they ought to be, given the actual objective facts, then they are more likely to comply with the orders
Yes,
that are ostensibly supposed to prevent it. Um,
absolutely.
and people told themselves stories that this was legitimate and right and good to do because if we don't, people will disobey and the COVID will then spread. The problem with that reasoning is that there's a few problems. One is eventually people will stop trusting you because they know you lied to them, right? So there's a tremendous lack of trust now in public health that didn't exist before because they embraced this idea of a quote noble lie. Second, um,
Noble lie.
well, we get you to do what you're supposed to do.
Yeah,
I mean, Gene, I mean,
it's
it's
the
like it's
noble
just
lie. We're lying
noble
for a
lie,
good reason, so don't be mad at us.
right? And then the second thing is that you have this like very naive notion of how societies actually function. That we're all like Howard Hughes, that we can sit in our mansions and stay
Mm.
apart from each other safely. When in fact the reality is we need human interaction. We need it like physical human interaction in order to be healthy, actually. Um, and so this idea that we should all treat each other as if we're biohazards is fundamentally actually bad for our health. Um,
Well, here's the thing, and this is the funny thing too, is they did a good number on everybody because one of the things they did was they came out and said, "Hey, we never said that it would stop the spread. We never said that you couldn't get it." So they lied, but what they were doing is they were getting other people to lie for them. They were getting the community to lie for them. They're getting people on MSNBC, CNN, late night talk shows, for crying out loud. You would have people in homes saying, if you don't, you have to get vaccinated for grandma and grandpa. Don't you love grandma and grandpa? You have to get vaccinated for them. People got disinvited from family functions. I had one friend who was babysitting his grandson every day along with his wife. And all of a sudden the vaccines come up and the son-in-law says, I don't want you babysitting my kid anymore. It's like, but when before the vaccine came out, you had no problems with it. And there's people who are like, well, I don't want to talk to you anymore because you're not vaccinated. It's like, yeah, but you had no problems a few months ago. It's insane what I saw. These COVID bullies, they thought that they were better than everyone else. And it was just fear mongering, but it worked. Jay, it worked. It worked because people were afraid. They did take the vaccine. More people took the vaccine than that wouldn't have if they had known. Half my students said they wouldn't have taken it if they had known. But I did a survey before the start of the semester, and I asked them. One of the questions was, if you get COVID, what do you think your chances are of getting it? Right, that famous 50% poll that was in the States. I had a quarter of my students say that they thought that if they got COVID, they would there's a 50% chance they will be hospitalized or die. And that was 3 months ago we did this survey. So it worked, Jay. It worked.
I mean, I think there's the aspect of, there's two elements of what you said, which I think are both important. One is the overestimation of the mortality risk to individuals, right? So you're scared, you're gonna, and that, by the way, is the reason why I don't hold it against people who acted like bullies, in a sense. I'm willing to forgive them because it was an intentional policy of public health to create that fear. And when people are in fear, they act in ways that are outside themselves. Like they're not acting as themselves. They're acting in some sort of hot-brained version of themselves.
It's a Milgram experiment version of themselves.
Yes,
right.
That's a great way to put it. And then the second aspect of that is this weaponization of empathy. There's this question, like, why did young people not protest? They're being harmed at scale. Why do they comply? It's because most young people are good people. They view themselves as good people. They don't want to kill grandma. And so you had a very clever propaganda campaign to make them think that if they acted in their own best interest, which actually would have been in society's best interest
exactly
also,
exactly yes,
that they were going to kill grandma.
Yeah.
The public health authorities weaponize the empathy of young people against themselves. And it's just tragic. Like ultimately what's going to happen is, Dean, is that some young person harmed by the lockdowns is going to write the history of it, and they're going to judge us very, very poorly, the adults that made these decisions.
Oh yeah, one day they're going to make a movie during this period, and people, the vaccine bullies, are going to watch this movie and they're going to see themselves on the screen, and they're going to see how ugly they looked. I want to just throw out some. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say there's a story I read about. There's a guy in Canada. He ran a business called No Papers Pizza. I don't know if you heard of him.
No.
He basically, so he didn't like the vaccine mandates, but I think it was Ontario or somewhere. He was forced to have these mandates in place. And so to check the vaccine status of every single patron who comes into his pizza place.
Oh, okay, yeah, we did do that. Yeah.
And so he had this guy come in. He's like, I don't have my papers, and he's like, obviously not vaccinated, but the guy just wants pizza. So he's like, okay, fine, you can have pizza. The authorities closed down his shop because he didn't discriminate against the unvaccinated, even though there was no evidence that the unvaccinated were actually any more dangerous to anybody else than the vaccinated. The vaccine doesn't stop you from getting or spreading COVID. So there's no categorical difference. If you're around a vaccinated person, you're safe. If you're around an unvaccinated person, you're unsafe. You could get COVID from either.
No, and people were ratting each other out. Like, people would go to a restaurant. So I have a close friend who owns a restaurant, and I was angry for him, actually, because he tells me some of the stories. We had one client, or one patron, walk into the kitchen to see if they were wearing masks or not, like, without asking anybody. Had another person who was complaining that he wasn't looking at other people's papers enough because he was just doing a quick glance. So you had all these hall monitors, right, everywhere. But I didn't expect that the hall monitors would be sitting next to you in the faculty, right? And this was the sad part. I think you see that a lot of people, especially before COVID, in academia, most lefties hated big pharma, right? I mean, let's be honest. They, big pharma this, big pharma that. And then I would have conversations with them about big pharma and how they need to be reeled in. And then these were the same people that were the COVID bullies, basically saying you need to be vaccinated. So you actually didn't believe in your worldview. You have no faith in your worldview. You just talk off the top of your head, whatever the situation is.
I mean, yeah, I mean, I teach at Stanford, the home of the famous Stanford prison experiment, right, where the
Yes,
hall
yes.
monitors were really cruel to their fellow students,
Mm-hmm.
just because they were designated hall monitors. Actually, I want to bring up something about you've been talking about like Kim Iverson and the left and being accused of being a Trumper. I think this is a really interesting, important thing. But it's really complicated, right? So first of all, the lockdowns were not obviously a left-wing thing, although it seems like that in
Right.
the US and Canada, right? You had a
Yeah.
Swedish health authority and you had a Swedish government, essentially a social democratic government, say no lockdowns. A left-wing government say no to lockdowns. You had right-wing governments in the US and in the UK embrace lockdowns. And of course, the left-wing government in Canada embraced a lockdown, right? But
Right.
then in the provinces, you had Douglas Ford embrace a lockdown. You had
Yes.
you had so it's a
Yeah.
very ideologically complicated thing. I think that the North American left, there's this bigotry sort of at the heart of the mainstream North American left against people on the right. They think of them as lesser somehow, intellectually lesser, not believing in science. The Trump accusation is a good example of this. I think that really harmed the ability of the mainstream left in North America to think clearly on these matters. There were some great Kim Iverson comes to mind as an exception, but that
Jimmy
was not
Dore has
what
been good to you as well.
Jimmy
I
Dore
mean,
is
he's
amazing.
this
He
this
was
has been
beautiful.
this is one thing I was actually going to ask you was the one good thing was, don't you find that your friends are better friends now? The friends
Well,
that you do have and the colleagues that you do respect are
I
like
I have
just the highest level of friends, right?
I mean, so I absolutely have a better class of friends than I once did. Although I do kind of want my, I mean, I'm willing to forgive them. I mean, I'm a very forgiving person. So, but I do think that it's hard to unsee what we saw. But so just to stay on the left right thing, I think, yeah, and on the right you had again a mix, right? There were people on the right that were asking for shutting down travel to China, that were asking for it was actually lockdowns were popular on the right, if we're being honest in
Beginning,
2020.
absolutely they were. When Trump was in office, yes, the lockdowns were, yeah,
Yeah,
they were
and
big.
you still have Trump defending the lockdowns. Um,
It's true.
so you have this like you have this very complicated story ideologically. It's not a clean left-right division. It's in fact, I don't know the answer to this. What made some people react negatively to lockdowns? And my first answer wouldn't be ideology, right? You had libertarians embracing lockdowns. You had left-wing socialists, the World Socialist uh, website fully still believes in zero COVID and lockdowns. So you had like very strange ideological bedfellows and agreeing on lockdowns on both sides. So I don't know how to characterize it. It's
No,
not
we're going to have to
ideology.
parse it down at some point, right? Like, because, like you just said, every country has different politics as well. So conservatism and liberalism isn't in the same Canada as in the United States, and we have more parties here. There, they have two parties. What would have happened if Trump would have won and he would have rolled out the vaccine? It would have been a different country. But
Well,
I got 10 minutes with you. So
can I say one more thing? One more
oh,
thing
yeah, absolutely. Go
before we
ahead.
get to point two,
I'm going
because
to
I
do
think
some rapid fire after.
I would love okay. We'll do left right, but
No,
let's
go.
just
Yeah, go ahead.
because like
Ask.
you're a political science person in Canada. This is a huge mystery to me. One of the most important acts during the pandemic that rescued us from lockdowns were these Canadian truckers. In like 2022, very effectively, essentially, I think led to the end of the lockdown regime and the vaccine mandates in Canada. I think that it's I don't see how you can look at it and say they weren't effective. It led to the Emergencies Act by Justin Trudeau, just violation of civil liberties, but still the lockdowns end. Um, the mystery to me is how is it that the NDP, which is an political organization, supposedly nominally representing labor, didn't support the truckers' protest?
The easy answer is political expediency. He just wanted to Jagdish Singh, who is leader of the NDP. If the Liberals had a majority government, I bet you he would have. I bet you they would have come out on the side of the worker, the side of the unions, right? The side of the truckers, the common man. But he's propping up a minority government and he wants to stay relevant. The other thing is, it's like you've said, what you've been talking about is you've got what are seemingly normal, intelligent people. And if you scare them enough, you can scare them into doing anything. And so it's either fear and they legitimately feared it, or it's political. He just wanted to remain relevant because he's kind of irrelevant now. That's the best guess. But it's funny that you ask me because I teach political science, but I actually hate teaching Canadian politics. I actually teach American politics, which is
Okay.
the funny thing. So I don't know. Does that answer? Or do you have a better theory?
No, I think
Because
that's true.
they were 80% vaccinated. You know that, right? The truckers,
Yeah, no, I
a lot of
know.
Indians too, a lot of Indian
Context, but
Nazis.
they call. I mean, I saw some pictures from this where of like this jumpy houses and like they're doing Indian Bhangra and they're just having a joyful time and somehow all of a sudden they're neo-Nazi Trumpers. I mean,
It,
the
it's
whole thing was just sickening to me.
it was one of the greatest public protests in history, in my opinion, because I thought it had efficacy. And one of the things is because people were actually they weren't destroying things, they weren't breaking things, but they quickly. I mean, there was one guy who was giving out coffee to protesters, and it's a similar situation with the pizza guy, and he got in trouble too. So here's some rapid fire, quick questions. I'm going to name some people, and just tell me what you think. And this is Rochelle Walensky. Is she a credible individual? This was the head of the CDC. She resigned. Every time I see her in Congress answering questions, she seems unhinged. Is she okay? Does she know what she's talking about?
I think that she did a very poor job as a CDC director. I think that she had a lot of irresponsible messaging, misread the evidence on vaccine efficacy, and generally was not a very effective. I think she diminished the trust in public health. I can go into reasons why I think it happened, but just let's leave it at that.
Okay. Peter Hotez, is this guy as dumb as he seems? I saw him on Joe Rogan, and if you can get, if a comedian doing a podcast can make you look dumb, I don't know.
Peter Hotez is a vaccinologist with very little experience in public health in terms of like how do you think about public health systems. Very little experience in social sciences. Very little experience in societies. He's extremely ideological. Has sort of this knee-jerk reaction. Lives in Texas, but I sort of hates. I think most like Texas, especially if they're right wing. Um, and but he's combined that with like he was one of the people that worked with the Wuhan lab, like sent money to the Wuhan lab from the
Oh,
United
yes,
Nations.
that's right.
And I think for him, this was his interactions with the public and with the scientific establishment in the pandemic have been very, very unfortunate. He's written a book called The Rise of Anti-Science, where he just sort of very simple, like very naively blames the right for anti-science attitudes, which he blames for the bad outcomes during the pandemic. Um, and I think it's really unfortunate that scientists have this kind of arrogance because I think ultimately the effect is that it diminishes confidence, public confidence in science, which is needed for science to actually function.
Absolutely. When my colleagues wanted me to ask you, actually, he thought that just like in the old days, where the only way you could vote was if you were, a white landowner, and then later, they had to decide who are we going to let vote. It's almost as if they're like, look, we're the smart ones, we're the ones that are wise, we have all the intelligence, and we want to go back to an era where we basically just roll out information to you, and basically you're just going to have to play along.
I mean, the best example of this is not Peter Hotez. The best example is Tony Fauci. I mean, at
Yeah,
one point
absolutely.
he
Yeah.
gave an interview where he's asked about I guess Rand Paul or someone was challenging him,
Yep.
and his response was like, "If you question me, you're not simply questioning a man; you are questioning science itself." And the arrogance of that statement is just mind-boggling, right? There is no single individual who is the high pope of science. Science is not that kind of enterprise
Yeah.
that it
It's the
has
opposite. That's
powerful
actually
sources.
the opposite of what science would be.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's built on skepticism. It's built on checking people's data. It's not built on a personality cult. But yet, during the pandemic, a single individual took that on himself, and it was a perversion of science.
Another quick one. Babies. Why would you, if you have a baby, why would you get your baby vaccinated? Is there
There's no
any
reason.
evidence that your baby should be vaccinated, your young child?
No. I mean, the thing is the mortality risk from COVID is tiny, tiny, tiny. One in somewhere between early in the pandemic, somewhere between 1 in 100,000 and 1 in 1 million, probably lower for children for dying from COVID. So and so that's the maximum benefit you could get from vaccinating is reduction of
That's
that
the
risk.
maximum benefit. And
Yeah.
what would be the maximum harm if you had an adverse event?
I mean, that's the thing. It's like, young men, I think that young men getting the vaccines, turns out the mRNA vaccines, was somewhat, you get myocarditis, inflammation of the heart at the rates of 1 in 2,000 and 1 in 10,000. That's a bad trade-off. Like, why would I want that risk for a minimal reduction in the mortality risk of dying if I get COVID? Um, you have to think from a benefit harm point of view, even for vaccines. Like, you can't just say religiously because it's a vaccine is automatically good. Sometimes I think it was in 2021, early 2021, it made absolute sense to vaccinate older people because there you have this large risk of dying, so potentially large benefit. And there may be side effects, but whatever they are likely to be outweighed by the benefit. Very different calculus for children, and certainly for babies. I'll tell you the other thing about the vaccine for babies. The randomized trials for the babies were terrible. Like, they didn't actually check to see if it reduced the risk of mortality. They checked to see if it produced antibodies, but I don't really care if I have antibodies specific to COVID in my kid. I want to know if it's going to protect them against dying. That's the only reason to give the vaccine to those kids. And the randomized trials didn't check that. And they couldn't check that because the risk of dying was so low in kids.
I have a friend who just had a baby, and I asked him if he was going to if he was going to get vaccinated. So that's why I asked that question. So you can watch that. One more before I let you go. This is from my colleague who actually teaches conspiracy theories. He wants to know because he's afraid of dating vaccinated women. He's afraid of vaccine of the spike protein shedding and him getting it. What does the science at this point say about that?
I don't believe that the science supports that idea. I think the
Okay.
vaccinated individuals are not shedding the spike protein any more than
If somebody
I think.
does claim that, they can't. There's no science that they can base that on. There's no report. There's no study. There's
I
no
mean,
ours.
there are people that
Is
write
there?
papers, but they're not credible to me. I think the
Okay.
papers that argue that are not don't they don't provide it. I mean, let me just put it this way: like, I think it doesn't make biological sense to me, and the epidemiological evidence would argue against it. So I just doesn't. I think the answer is no. That's not a thing.
I know, but you are a fringe epidemiologist, doctor.
I mean, you do what you can.
Put it on your business card. I know you joked
I
about it,
I
but did
have
you
one. I have
actually
one.
do it?
Yes, I got. Okay, oh shoot.
That is awesome.
Okay, I have it. I have it back. So a friend of mine had a had a business card made with it.
That's awesome. Well, listen, you're when I told my students I was going to be interviewing you, it was the most excitement I got out of them. They like perked up. We covered your case. We covered a whole ton of stuff. How the state basically just comes down on people and they do it over a 24-hour period. They did it to Russell Brand, did it to you, Jimmy Dore, Kim Iverson. The list goes on. RFK, look at RFK, right? So I really want to thank you for taking this time. It's amazing because you are in a lot of high-profile podcasts and television shows. Although I don't think CNN, MSNBC, Fox, they're not going to invite you on, right?
I've been Fox invited
Fox
me on
did.
a lot. Yeah, but and CNN a few times, never on MSNBC.
Yeah, you're just not right for them. You just don't tell the right
Exactly.
narrative. It's
Too
all about the
fringe.
narrative. Thank you very much. I'm going to end my recording right here before I say goodbye to you. Do uh, actually, I don't even know how to do it. Oh, there it is. End meeting for all. Bye, folks.